They see a guard. I've known that my whole career. A uniform, a desk, a ring of keys, the man you wave at on your way to somewhere that matters. I stopped minding a long time ago. You stop minding a lot of things once you have a daughter who fences competitively and needs you home by 6 most mornings to drive her to practice. June calls it footwork. She'll run the kitchen in her socks at 11 at night, pivoting off the ball of her foot, resetting, pivoting again. Quiet feet, clear mind, she says, which is something she came up with herself at 14, and which I have never told her I spent 21 years teaching to other people under less forgiving circumstances. You let your children think they invented things. It's one of the quiet gifts of fatherhood. I'd been the overnight shift supervisor at Callaway Tower for 3 years when Sentinel Solutions won the building management contract in March. I wasn't concerned. I'd outlasted 2 other firms. The building's general manager, a patient man named Gerald Foss, had kept me through both transitions because I knew the property, every corridor, every load-bearing wall, every camera blind spot, every elevator shaft that whistled when the wind came in off the harbor. I knew the overnight rhythms of a 30-story glass and steel tower the way a good sailor knows a harbor. That knowledge is worth something. Mara Price arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. She was 38, polished in the way that corporate efficiency consultants are polished. The suit, the tablet, the practice pace through a space she'd already decided she understood. She had the building's floor plan on her screen before she'd introduced herself to anyone on the desk. I logged her in at 2:14 p.m. She barely glanced at me. The meeting was in the 3rd floor conference room. Gerald was there. 3 members of my overnight team were there, invited as a courtesy, which I recognized immediately as a warning. Mara stood at the front of the room and explained in even, pleasant language that Sentinel Solutions was standardizing staffing models across its Mid-Atlantic portfolio. The new model called for a tiered response team on overnight shifts, younger contractors with recent certifications, deployed in rotating 4-hour blocks. Overhead would be reduced. Redundancies would be eliminated. She looked at me when she said redundancies. Not rudely, just directly, the way you look at a line item you've already decided to cut. "Mr. Colton," she said, "your file shows 21 years of prior service and 3 years in this role. That's an impressive tenure. But the new model doesn't carry a legacy supervisor position at your pay grade. We'll honor your contract through Friday." Gerald looked at the table. My team looked at me. I looked at Mara Price and nodded once. "Understood," I said. She seemed mildly surprised that I didn't argue. People usually argue. I had nothing to argue. She wasn't being cruel, she was being efficient. Those are different things, and I've learned not to confuse them. I drove home, picked June up from practice, made dinner. She told me about a new advance she was working on, a Fletch, a running attack she'd been timing wrong. We talked about weight transfer. We talked about how the feet know before the mind does if you train them right. I didn't mention Mara Price or Friday. I went back in Thursday night at 11. The Sentinel Solutions contractors had been filtering in for 2 days by then, 6 of them on the overnight rotation, all former law enforcement or military, all credentialed, all younger than me by at least 15 years. They were professional. They ran their check-ins on schedule. They knew their posts. The team lead was a compact, serious man named Wade Acaffer, retired Army, 2-tour, moved with the particular economy of motion that tells you a person has been trained properly and has retained it. I introduced myself at the desk. He shook my hand, said "sir" out of habit, caught himself, and said my name instead. We did one joint walkthrough of the building at midnight building protocol until the transition was complete. He asked good questions. I gave him straight answers. We walked the east stairwell, the server corridor on 14, the loading dock. I showed him where the camera on the parking level had a 7-second lag on its rotation. He wrote it down. At 1:47 a.m., the east stairwell door on the 2nd floor opened without a badge read. I was at the desk. I saw it on camera before the motion sensor flagged it. I saw the second figure come through 14 seconds later. I saw the third hold the door from outside. 3 people, moving in coordinated silence, none of them in any uniform this building used. I picked up my radio. Aquifer, East Stair, second floor, 3 in, no badge, moving up. A pause, copy. I'm dispatching Reyes and Kim to intercept. I was already moving. Not because I doubted Aquifer, because I knew what Reyes and Kim had trained on, and I knew what 3 people moving like that in a building like this usually meant, and I know the difference between a protocol and a situation. Gerald Foss had built the server room on 14 to house the consolidated data for 6 regional subsidiaries. Whatever was on those drives was worth enough for someone to send a 3-person team into a 30-story building at 2 in the morning. That is not a paperwork problem. I took the west stair at a pace that didn't announce itself. Quiet feet, clear mind. I came out on 14 at 1:51 a.m., and I knew before I turned the corner that Reyes was in trouble, because I could hear the particular quiet that follows a radio being taken from someone's hand. I won't describe what happened in the next 4 minutes in detail. It's not a thing that needs dramatizing. I had 21 years of training, 2 of them spent teaching the highest level combatives curriculum the Army certifies to men who were going to need it in places that didn't have corridors at all, and I was operating in a hallway I had walked every single night for 3 years. I knew the width of the corridor. I knew the door that swings inward. I knew the step down at the junction of the server room entrance that trips people who don't know it's there. 3 trained people, moving in a building they'd studied from a floor plan, are still moving in a building they don't know. I did. I had the first one against the wall before he registered I was in the hallway. The second came wide, which was the right instinct in the wrong building. There is no wide on 14, just a corridor that narrows at the fire panel. The third held at the door, which told me he was the one with the drive reader, which meant he was the one I needed to reach last and hold in place. I worked backward from that. Reyes was on one knee, radio gone, hands up by reflex. I told him to stay down. He stayed down. It was over at 1:55. I'd zip-tied all 3 to the server room door handles with the ties I carry on my belt, which is a habit from a previous life that Gerald had never once questioned. And I was calling the duty officer when Aquifer came around the corner at a run with Kim behind him. He pulled up hard when he saw me. He looked at the 3 men on the floor. He looked at me. He looked at my hands still at my sides, no weapon drawn because I hadn't needed one. "You're Colton," he said slowly, not a question. "I am. Colonel Colton." He was very still. "Fort Bragg, 2011, 3rd Battalion Combatives Block, Level 4 certification course." I looked at him for a moment. Then I recognized the set of his shoulders, the particular way he'd stopped moving, which was the way men stop moving when they're recalibrating something they thought they understood. "Aquifer," I said, "you qualified expert on the ground defense sequence." He blinked. "Yes, sir." "You did it in 4 minutes 40. I told you to get it under 4. Did you ever get it under 4? A pause. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. 3:58, 6 months after the course. "Good," I said. I picked up my radio and called it in. The police arrived at 2:09. The duty officer arrived at 2:14. Mara Price, who had been working late in the 3rd-floor conference room, which I had not known, arrived in the lobby at 2:22, summoned by the alert on her building management tablet, and found Aquifer and his team standing at the desk while I filed the incident report in the same unhurried handwriting I used every night. She stood at the edge of the desk for a moment. "Mr. Colton," she said. "Ms. Price." "Are you—" She stopped, started again. "The men on 14, were any of my contractors injured?" "Reyes has a bruised wrist. He'll be fine. He made a good decision under pressure." I kept writing. Kim held his corridor correctly. Akafor responded to the radio call at the right speed. They're a solid team. She was quiet for a moment. The three in custody. Corporate espionage, most likely. The server room on 14 carries data for your firm's 6 regional subsidiaries, among others. Gerald Foss will want to audit the drive access logs in the morning. I looked up. I left a note on his desk. She looked at me, the way people look at a thing they have misfiled. Akafor was still at the edge of the lobby, not quite pretending not to listen. After a moment he said, "Ma'am, for your records, Mr. Colton holds a Duty Master Combatives Instructor certification. He trained my entire battalion at Bragg. He also trained the Level 3 team leads at Sentinel's Northern Virginia hub. I didn't know that until tonight." A pause. I should have looked harder. Mara Price's eyes moved from Akafor to me. She was quiet for 5 seconds. "I know because I counted." "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. "In the meeting." I thought about June running the kitchen in her socks, pivoting, resetting, getting the weight transfer exactly right. I thought about how she'd come home from practice that Thursday with a bruise on her wrist she was pretending wasn't there, and how I'd seen it immediately, and how I'd said nothing because she needed to figure out what had gone wrong on her own. "It wasn't relevant to the meeting," I said. "The meeting was about the staffing model." She didn't have an answer for that. Sentinel Solutions Regional Director called Gerald Foss at 7 the next morning. I know because Gerald called me at 7:15, laughing in the low, quiet way he laughs when something has surprised him, which is not often. The ask was straightforward. Sentinel wanted me, not as a guard, not as a legacy supervisor, but as a consulting instructor for their Mid-Atlantic workforce. 6 regional hubs, 43 contractors in active rotation, a combatives and situational response curriculum that, in Gerald's words, apparently does not currently account for the fact that corridors narrow at fire panels. Gerald asked if I was interested. I told him I'd think about it. I drove June to practice. I watched her run the fletch from the baseline, right foot, transfer, extension. And she got the timing right on the 4th try and looked over her shoulder at me with an expression that was trying very hard not to be proud of itself. I drove back to Callaway Tower at 10:30. Mara Price was in the lobby, not in the conference room. In the lobby at the desk, standing in the same spot where she'd barely glanced at me 4 days earlier. She had a contract folder and she looked like a woman who had decided to do something she didn't particularly enjoy and had decided to do it anyway, which is a quality I respect. She slid the folder across the desk. "The terms are on page 2, she said. "Consulting rate, 4 days a week, flexible scheduling. Gerald said you have a standing commitment on Friday mornings. That's written in." I opened the folder. The terms were fair, more than fair. "There's one more thing," she said, and for the first time she sounded like she was choosing her words carefully. "I read your service record this morning, all of it." A pause. "I should have read it Wednesday." I looked at her for a moment. She held my eyes steadily, which takes something. "Yes," I said, "you should have." She nodded. She had nothing to add to that, and she was smart enough not to try. I picked up the pen I used to log visitor badges. The same black ballpoint, same clip worn smooth from 3 years of my thumb. I signed the contract on the line where my name was printed, slid it back across the desk, and reached for my radio to run the 9 o'clock walkthrough I had not yet done. Some things you do because you're asked. Some things you do because the building needs it, and you're the one who knows where the corridors narrow. I've never been able to tell the difference, and I'm not sure I want to. June qualified expert on the fletch that Friday, 3 minutes 41. I was there.